Okay, it's so lovely to be with you. So I'm Peter Adey. I'm a Professor of Human Geography. I've worked at Royal Holloway since early 2012. I teach on mobilities, topics like the city and security, and I do that to undergraduates, to postgraduates, and to PhD students. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about air travel mobilities. Air travel is, of course, something we've been thinking about quite a lot, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, because of course it's something that we haven't been able to do. It stopped in a lot of countries, and especially between countries. International air travel declined by about 50%. So I'll come back to this graph later, but the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, estimate in 2020 that passenger travel declined by 1.6 billion. So 1.6 billion fewer passengers, which is an enormous statistic. But perhaps even more profound is the number of passengers that were being flown around the world before the pandemic, around 4.5 billion. That's over half the world's population flying by air. Of course, not all of them, and not all of them at the same time. That's more like 1 to 1.5 million people in the air. But of course, not all of us can fly by air. And let us also note in this little opening that ICAO called this an assault on international mobility. That's the title of this news piece, which is interesting phrasing, an assault on international mobility. Let's just hold those in our mind for a moment. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is to examine and pick apart air travel and mobility, or mobilities, and to ask, what does that mean? What might ICAO have meant by that? We also haven't, of course, always travelled by air, just in the same way that we've been experiencing a moment of aviation's pause or disruption, if you like. So where and how have we learnt to travel by air? And how has air travel mobility become so essential to the connections and flows that move our world, to processes such as those that we call like globalisation? And also, where are we when we travel by air? We'll look at the airport as a key infrastructure of air travel mobilities. And then in the last substantive section of the lecture, we're going to think about how air travel has been, well, for ICAO, assaulted, but we might perhaps better say challenged, in the context of the pandemic, in the context of security, and of course in the context of climate change. In terms of connecting this to some different A-level syllabuses, there are some interesting connections you can make between this lecture and the curriculum. And through that you might pull out perhaps 3 key things that I think will be useful to you. So the first, of course, is that air travel is about connections, and we're going to be examining some of those connections in the context of global systems and global processes. But air travel is not just about the international in some kind of vague space, but it's also about the local. Air travel feeds connections to particular places, and of course it changes the nature of those places as it does so. And those connections are equally more fragile than perhaps we've been led to believe. That disease and terrorism can affect air travel with effect on supply chains, economies, and of course our well-being. Okay, so some key terms for us to work with. What are air travel mobilities? Well, by air travel we mean simply travelling by air, and we're mostly talking about fixed-wing aeroplanes on charter holiday flights or for commercial scheduled airlines. Although one of the outcomes of the pandemic, interestingly, has been a disproportionate return to private jet travel, where the rich or high net worth individuals use jets, and as do global corporate companies, elites, the famous and politicians to travel the world, and that's returned to almost at the same levels before the pandemic. And this is partly why we use terms like mobilities or mobility rather than simply just travel or transport. Because we understand mobility as movement, but movement as being more than simply moving from one place to another, from A to B. But by mobility we also mean the experience, so what it feels like, what it means, but also the inequalities of those movements. So in other words, like the corporate jet set, we don't all move in the same way. How we move, even by air, is in part a product of who we are, our access to wealth, to resources, our status, our identities, maybe even our nationality, our race. We also tend to talk about mobilities rather than mobility, because when we're thinking about mobility or movement, we're often talking about more than one. and that the relationships of one person's movement to another is important. And we're also talking about not just people, but we might be thinking about things, commodities, capital, even animals. And finally, when we discuss mobility, we're also not assuming that the aeroplane is the most interesting thing. Of course it is interesting, but it depends on particular infrastructures, which it's closely tethered to, even if the aeroplane's flying in the air. Some of those infrastructures are quite fixed, and that could be about airports, which are huge, massive infrastructures that we're going to be talking about. Some of those infrastructures could be, they're more things that are written down. They're about legislation, they're about law, international law, they're about international standards and agreements, or they're about the ways that people manage and organise airspace itself. Okay, so where have air travel mobilities come from? Well, we need to remember that air travel has been strongly about empires and colonies. Air travel has been a way of connecting or tying colonial networks together, as well as encouraging international travel. It was also about empire building and its maintenance, but also to some extent conflict too. The commercial aeroplane had a shadow, the bomber and the fighter plane. War and defence was one of the other primary motivations to develop so-called air power. In this map, you can see the England-Australia service provided by British Imperial Airways and Qantas, the Australian airline, in the 1930s. And if you look at where it goes, it's quite revealing. So you can see it runs from London through to Paris, to British Egypt, Cairo, to the British Mandate in Palestine, to Iraq, which was Mandatory Iraq to 1930, to Bahrain, a British protectorate, to Pakistan and Delhi, what was British India, to Myanmar, what was Burma, to Singapore, a British colony, to Indonesia, very briefly a British colony, and eventually to Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia, the territory administered by the Federal Commonwealth of Australia. Whilst for other countries such as Italy, there is work exploring its own flight connections to countries such as Ethiopia or Italian Ethiopia, which are occupied in the 1930s. Of course, air travel mobilities was about sustaining empire, but it was also about building prestige and national identity. Air travel, even if it seems mundane today, expresses national interests and ambitions. Aeroplanes can symbolise very positive things, although maybe we might think about them quite differently today. But they've been seen to symbolise feelings of reach, being able to grasp across space, speed, technology, progress. There are things that ideas of nationhood, or perhaps here Britishness, which want to try to kind of pull these things together. We call airlines like British Airways flag-carrying airlines because they literally carried the flag for Britain or for other nations. So I've mentioned Alitalia or Air Italy. We could mention KLM, I won't pronounce this in Dutch, but Royal Dutch Airlines of the Netherlands. Or of course there are Air France, Singapore Airlines. These national airlines have been seen to symbolise and carry certain characteristics of the nation. And through flying, through air travel mobilities, we've come to know the world, and sometimes through quite superficial ideas of difference and cultural diversity. And when I say we, think about those colonial origins I've mentioned, because of course the emergence of the very first airlines were overwhelmingly dominated by those from the global north. In this Pan-American Airlines advert from the 1950s, we see demonstrated some of the stereotyped imaginations of different places that air travel will supposedly allow someone to experience or to reach or to feel. So this is globalisation, but in the form of tourist practices and imaginations of other cultures. One of the best places to think about or kind of see the geography of air travel mobilities is of course the airport. And airports themselves have emerged. If we ask where have they come from, well, they've come from very small beginnings. Many airports grew from small airfields. Of course, some of these still exist. Liverpool Airport at Speke, which I studied for my PhD, was originally based in a farmhouse. The control tower was basically in the roof and the air traffic controllers perched out of the window. Whilst today vast throughputs of millions of passengers per year are carried from many international airports. International airports are huge drivers of jobs. For every million passengers that passes through them per year, around 1,000 jobs are created. They also resemble cities and are planned as such. They contain hotels, car hire, police forces, fire and emergency personnel, their vast food and entertainment complexes. And this has led some urban planners to begin to develop the idea of an airport city or aerotropolis, where we use airport development master planning to drive economies. And this is because airports have some of the same economies of scale of cities, but also the vast benefit of the throughput of passengers, the millions of passengers that pass through them, but perhaps without the density and limitations of a city. So many airport cities are able to become conference centres and exhibition halls and centres. They can be used for warehousing as logistics hubs. They can be used as science parks and even theme and leisure areas. So we thought about representations of other places through some different imaginations of air travel a moment ago and from a while ago. And I've also just mentioned the airport as a considerable infrastructural and economic entity. But in this slide we might think about how air travel also creates particular and peculiar kinds of places, like the airport terminal. And this is an image of Heathrow's Terminal 5 once you pass through to airside, once you pass through security. Some of you might have been there. But given all of the things that an airport does, we might ask, what kind of place is this? Is it a place where we wait and then go? Places where we might imagine being somewhere else, where our options seem open, the world is your oyster, sense of freedom. Perhaps there are also places that we have little attachment or meaningful connection to, we just pass through them. They might also be places where we struggle to feel at home. For some then, the airport is a symbol of globalisation. You might think about the kind of global brands that are available in the airport, the collision of different food cultures and restaurants, Italian fashion houses, perfumes from France, multiple languages on the signs and in the air. But there's also something homogeneous about them, and many airports feel like other airports, and this is one of the other sides of globalisation, that as places are brought closer together, they take on some of those characteristics of the elsewhere. The design and architecture of airports and how you navigate them is even deliberately about familiarity, so that anyone might navigate them. So what is this then about airports and air travel mobilities creating spaces that feel like anywhere else, that feel homogeneous? But at the same time, some airports have resisted this globalising impulse to be like any other. Some airports, known as hub airports, are being marketed around shopping and around their identity. Even smaller regional airports rely on regional branding to be seen as belonging to a particular place. You might think of the naming of some airports in the UK, like Liverpool John Lennon Airport, named after the Beatle, or Doncaster Robin Hood Airport. Think about the kind of local cultural connections that naming performs. But of course airports rely upon passengers to travel through them, and hub airports particularly are about encouraging passengers to transit through them. So for example, if you've been to Asia or Australasia, you might have stopped off or transited through Singapore Changi, through Hong Kong, through Dubai maybe. And these airports have turned away from the kind of homogeneous qualities of places in globalisation, but try instead to emphasise their distinctiveness as an experience, perhaps even suggesting themselves as a kind of luxurious place. Singapore Changi is known as one of the best airports in the world, notable for becoming a little bit like a theme park. It already had a cinema, a butterfly garden, lots of children's playgrounds, and now, just opened a year or so ago, it has the Jewel, and I suggest you watch some of the videos about it, which is an extraordinary multi-billion-dollar facility or building that includes an indoor rainforest, a waterfall at the centre that you can see in this image, light shows are projected onto it, it's passed by a monorail that you can see just in front, there are treetop walks, games for children, quite high-end shopping outlets and many places to eat. Okay, in this section we're going to try not to pretend that air travel is a smooth system of mobility. In this section that I've split into three, we're going to consider several ways that air travel has been challenged as a form of international global mobility. We're going to firstly deal with terrorism and security, then disruptions and emergencies, and finally climate change. So first, in the context of terrorism and security, of course terrorism was not a new thing on September the 11th, which of course has just experienced its 20-year anniversary. But the crashing of the two planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and of course Flight 93, which was brought down, led to a wholesale increase in the way air aviation security was viewed and practiced, and also observed by wider publics too. Whilst terrorists might have threatened air travel and aircraft, of course so too does security. Security might inhibit us, limit us, and make problematic assumptions and judgments. Many practices brought into air travel since 9/11, from scanning beneath passenger clothing to behaviour detection, has raised serious questions about how societies secure the skies and whether the practices that have been used are fair or proportionate or right. One of the outcomes of the 9/11 attacks was of course both the racist suspicion of Muslim, Middle Eastern, North African and Asian bodies, to the extent that many have suffered discrimination and abuse, hate and highly unfair practices when attempting to fly. So when we talk about driving while black and historic and contemporary discriminations black drivers have been subjected to, especially by law enforcement, air travel is perhaps another but very visible microcosm of discrimination and mobility, which has given rise to expressions such as flying while brown, flying while black, flying while Muslim, and even flying while fat. But air travel mobility is also highly vulnerable to disruption, and this can have severe knock-on effects for societies. So you might consider this in relation to our experience of automobility, so driving, in relation to the current fuel crisis that we're kind of in the midst of. And this is a crisis produced by driver shortages for the delivery of fuel, but also so-called panic buying. And then this has created particular kinds of difficulties for obtaining petrol over the last couple of weeks or so in October of this year. We might ask really kind of what sort of disruptions does an event like this create if we can't move about? The effect of the pandemic on air travel, as we've mentioned, has been severe. So we've seen significant falls in global travel. This has changed the experience of air travel too for those who have been able to experience flying. They've undergone new regimes and sometimes inadequate regimes of COVID security in airports and on planes, in private testing regimes, in quarantine measures in hotels. Sometimes that cost a lot of money. And also inadequate and difficult bureaucracies of form filling and so on. And this has meant that some businesses have struggled, families have been severed, especially those who live abroad and those that have family and relations in other countries. And as a result, many holidays have become much more local. But the pandemic's effect on air travel has been perhaps preceded on a smaller scale by other kinds of disruption. And I'm thinking in particular in 2010 for a couple of weeks during April, where what you might think about as a kind of natural hazard was produced by an ash cloud that formed from the eruption of a subglacial volcano in Iceland, and this brought chaos to the European air industry and further beyond. I happened to be at a conference of geographers in Washington DC during those weeks that the ash cloud affected, and all of our flights were cancelled, effectively closed airspace over Europe during the course of about a week to 10 days. This meant that we had to remain in the US for much longer before the ash cloud diminished and flights returned to normal. It had a relatively minor effect on me, but what other effects might an event like this produce for others? So some of the effects of the crisis were quite surprising and far-reaching. It had particular consequences on perishable goods that were being delivered into Europe and between by plane. For example, the Kenyan cut flower industry suggested to the BBC that it was costing growers between $1.5 million to $2 million a day because some of the flowers which were held in cold storage at Nairobi airport would spoil, which was a major export for East African nations. This led to job losses in the industry of low-wage labour, some of whom were earning just a few dollars a day. The mass wastage, millions of flowers were destroyed. But equally, across Europe, families struggled without wage earners, carers, parents that could not return home. Some tourists were repatriated by governments, including the UK's, who sent ferries to Spain. And some of these effects are what researchers call the cascading consequences or cascading effects of a crisis. that come about because of how mobility like air travel is embedded in our ways of life. So a volcano creates an ash cloud, which creates airport and airspace closures, which creates travel cancellations, disruptions, a massive delay and chaos, which then in turn creates other kinds of societal effects by the fact that we cannot move in the ways that we've planned to or become used to. Okay, let's finally consider air travel and air travel mobilities in the context of the challenge of climate change. And what does that mean for air travel mobilities? There is of course a link to the pandemic, given some of the shock that airlines were shown to be still flying empty planes when travellers were not allowed to travel, so-called ghost flights. This was eventually stopped, but airlines were doing it to try to keep lucrative landing slots at airports like Heathrow. Airlines compete for slots to fly out of airports. The busiest airports have the most competitive slots, and to comply with their agreements, if the airlines stop flying, they might lose those slots. But the story also demonstrated some of the contradictions around air travel, which is a highly polluting way to travel, with some of the imperatives, national and global targets to reduce global carbon emissions. Aviation produces around 2 to 2.5% of global CO2 emissions, but its impact is higher as it produces other emissions as well. It has, however, become much more efficient as it has grown as an industry. It's way more efficient to fly today than it was in the 1950s or 1930s, some of the periods that we thought about earlier. Engines are better, fuel is better, planes are fuller and larger, and airports and infrastructure are perhaps easier to move to net or zero carbon than the aircraft. But maybe we can leave you with a kind of question or series of questions, given what we've said about some of the cultural and economic advantages of air travel. Can we do it less? But indeed, how do we do it less? So there are some initiatives for electric aircraft, and there are initiatives for low carbon kerosene and so-called sustainable aviation fuels. But are other options more realistic, to simply fly a bit less or fly a lot less? And how might we do that in a way that is just or fair? Can we all expect seriously to float across the Atlantic on a zero carbon small yacht in the way that Greta Thunberg did? And maybe the answer is probably not, but if slower forms of mobility are one of the answers to international and long distance travel, so not by air, who can afford to do that? Flying has become relatively cheap. Who is now time rich enough to do that? Who can unlink themselves from their family lives, their social obligations, their work commitments to take that kind of time? So what we need to think about is, as we find alternatives, if we have to air travel mobilities, how might we find other forms of international mobility that are fair and that we might say are just? Okay, so let me summarise where we've got to in this lecture. So to begin with, we thought about air travel mobilities and we wondered what that might mean. What does mobility mean? And we talked about mobility as the movement, but also the experience and the meaning, but also the inequalities of movement. So when we think about air travel mobilities, we need to think about who has access to it and how might their experience of air travel mobilities be different. We also are thinking about more than just people, or more than just one person. We talk about mobilities in the plural. We talk about people moving in relation to each other, but also other things, commodities, capital, carbon, etc. And when we think about air travel mobilities, we're also interested in its spaces and places. So we talk quite a lot about the airport and its infrastructures. Secondly, we looked at air travel mobilities and where they came from. And we looked at how air travel emerged from empires and colonialism. And we asked and looked at how they've shaped our view of the world. We thought about the airport as a place of globalization, a place produced through air travel, but equally a place that is the product of connections between places. And some of the tendencies for homogeneity, so that airports seem to be like lots of other places, and like airports seem very similar or the same. But we also looked at concerns, particularly from within hub airports, to try to add distinctiveness and difference to the airport, to make them attractive to those who might transit through them. And finally, we thought about at length some of the different challenges around air travel mobilities. Flying is not plain sailing. It's been subject to disruption and emergencies, from the pandemic to an Icelandic volcano. It's been subjected to violence, to terrorism, but equally processes of security or securitization. And finally, we thought about the big challenge of today, perhaps the most urgent and emergent, is one of the climate emergency, and what might air travel mobilities look like in the future. And thanks very much for listening.